Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharmasvarupini avatara varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our ongoing class on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. We did our first class last month. We're doing class 2 today. So even if you missed the last class, it's not the end of the world. It's on YouTube. You can catch up pretty quickly. But you do need this main textbook, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali by Edwin Bryant, and as supplemental textbooks, Swami Vivekananda's Raja Yoga and Swami Hariharananda Āraṇya's the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, Yoga Philosophy of Patanjali. All right. Now, what was today's assignment? Today's assignment was, I hope you guys did it, pages 1 through 21 of Bryant's book, which consists of his commentaries on Sutras 1.1 and 1.2, the first 2 sutras of the Yoga Sutras. A heads up for our next class, the assignment is a little bit shorter, mercifully, pages 22 to 31 of Bryant's book, which is his commentary on the Sutras 1.3 to 1.5. Okay, that's the assignment. It's about 10 pages. As I mentioned in the previous class, as an extra fun challenge, apart from the reading assignments and the difficulty of grasping what Patanjali is saying and practicing it, I suggested an extra challenge, which is to try to memorize the sutras as we go along in class. So for today, for instance, the expectation, fully optional, for those of you who are brave enough to try this, try to memorize the sutras. So today, we'll be reciting Sutras 1.1 and 1.2 together. And if you haven't memorized it, just read from your book. When I repeat it, when I say it, recite it once, you then repeat it to me. Okay? And in terms of an overview, so Yoga Sutra consists of 4 main chapters. Each one has a different title. The title of the first chapter is Samadhipada. Samadhipada. That means the chapter on Samadhi. That's what we'll be discussing today. Samadhi is defined by Bryant as meditative absorption, and we'll see shortly when we discuss 1.2 that it's the goal of the entire yoga practice and philosophy. Okay? Second book, or second chapter of the Yoga Sutra is called Sadhanapada. Sadhana means what? Spiritual practice. So that's the second one. And you get the famous Ashtanga Yoga there, the 8-limbed yoga. We'll talk about that when we get to book 2, possibly earlier, but not today. Third chapter of the Yoga Sutra is called Vibhuti-pada. Vibhuti means supernormal powers, or siddhis is another term for them. And the fourth and final chapter of the Yoga Sutra is called Kaivalya-pada. Kaivalya literally means aloneness or isolation. It again is another way of describing the ultimate aim of yoga, which is to realize that the Purusha is completely separate from Prakriti, nature. One thing to keep in mind, these titles of these different chapters are not meant to be sort of comprehensive. So it's not that the first chapter, which we'll start discussing today, only discusses Samadhi. That's completely false. That's one of many topics discussed. It is one of the focuses, you can say, of the first book, but it doesn't exhaust the topics discussed in the first book, first chapter, and that goes for all of them. The second chapter is called Sadhanapada, the chapter on spiritual practice. That does not mean that there's no discussion of spiritual practice in the first chapter. In fact, there's a lot. There's plenty of discussion of spiritual practice in 1 and other places. One nice thing, among the many nice things about Bryant's book, is that he helpfully has given us chapter summaries, very brief, succinct chapter summaries. So I want us to turn to that. Please turn to page 475. It helps to, it's easy to get lost in the weeds, you know. when we discuss particular sutras. So it's good to have in mind the broader arc of the entire first chapter, Samadhipada. So let's read together the summary, Edwin Bryant's summary of this first chapter, the Samadhipada, the chapter on meditative absorption. He says as follows: the chapter begins by introducing and defining yoga 1 through 2, sutras 1 through 2. That's what we'll be discussing today. This is followed by a discussion of the two possible options for awareness, sutras 3 through 4. A description of the Vrittis, the fluctuations or changes of the mind, sutras 5 through 11. And how to control the Vrittis by practice and dispassion, Abhyasa and Vairagya, sutras 12 through 16. Notice, already, 12 through 16, isn't that a spiritual practice? Practicing Abhyasa and Vairagya, dispassion, of course, they're spiritual practices. So you can already see that there's discussion of spiritual practice already in chapter 1. Then Brian says, then comes the division of samadhi into sampragyata and asampragyata, sutras 17 through 18, and how to attain these different states of samadhi, sutras 20 through 22, after the discussion of other states that might resemble it, the state of samadhi. That's sutra 19. Ishvara, meaning the personal God, is then introduced as the easy method of attaining samadhi. It's also really interesting. What is the status of God in Patanjali's philosophy? It's a very controversial question among scholars, and Bryant takes a strong stand on it, partly because he has Vaishnava leanings, and he himself is a bhakta. So he claims that the Yoga Sutra is not just compatible with bhakti, but in fact prescribes bhakti, recommends bhakti. Okay, so Ishvara is then introduced as the easy method of attaining samadhi, Sutra 23, along with his nature, Ishvara's nature, Sutras 24 to 26, and the chanting of Ishvara's name, Sutras 27 through 29. The chapter describes the distractions of the mind and their accompanying effects, Sutras 30 to 31, and prescribes meditation on any object to combat them, with various examples presented, Sutras 32 to 40. Again, a lot of this chapter is about spiritual practice, even though it's called Samadhipada. Samapatti is introduced with its varieties, and he'll explain what Samapatti is later. It's Sutras 41 to 45, and their fruits, 46 to 48, and object, Sutra 49. The chapter concludes with a discussion of sampragyata samadhi, preceding the final stage of asampragyata, sutras 50 to 51. So the whole chapter has 51 sutras. This gives a really nice synoptic overview of the structure of this first chapter, what we can expect. So let's look at Yoga Sutra 1.1 and 1.2 first. And as I promised, we're going to start by reciting the first two sutras. As I said already, but for those of you who came in a bit late, those of you who have memorized, you can shut your eyes and try to recite them with me. Or not with me, but after me, but without looking. And those of you who have not memorized, you can just read the text in transliteration or in Devanagari, whatever you're comfortable with. Atha yoganushasanam yogaschitta vritti nirodha. Good. And I've added under the YouTube description of this class, for those online also, a document from sanskritdocuments.org, which just contains a list of all the sutras in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which facilitates memorization. Because it's harder to memorize when the sutras are 2 pages apart, 4 pages apart. So it's just like a list, and you can just keep going through them if you're trying to memorize them. It's easy now. Today was very easy. It's only 2 sutras. It gets harder because in our next class, we'll do 1 through 5, and it gets a little bit more daunting. I'm trying it myself because I haven't memorized the text, to be honest. And so it'll be a challenge for me too. Okay. So let's look at 1.1. Atha Yoga Anushasanam. What does it mean? Brian's translation is, now the teachings of yoga, and then he adds in square brackets, which means that those words are not explicit, but it's implied, are presented. The teachings of yoga are presented. First big question, which is why I titled, I'm trying something new here. As opposed to my Gita class, I'm giving unique titles to each of my classes. So today's title is, what is yoga? Because that's one of the main topics. Not the only topic, but it's one of the main topics. Clickbait. Okay. So, what is yoga? There are two common conceptions of yoga, which Patanjali does not mean. So I think it's very important to disambiguate here. First, common understanding of yoga. This one. No, well, that's good. Yeah, see, you're a Vedanta. Narayana's way ahead of us all. He doesn't even need to come to class. He's practically liberated. So, yeah, no. Let's start with the yoga class yoga. Yogasanas, postural yoga, downward dog and so on. That's a very common understanding of yoga these days, especially in the West. But that's not what yoga means, according to Patanjali. Secondly is what our spiritual aspirant Narayana says, the Vedantin. People who have some knowledge of Vedanta, when they hear yoga, they'll immediately think, Vivekananda, 4 yogas. Yoga means yoking, uniting. Uniting what with what? Interesting. I stumped him. Okay, well, now you're using Sankhya terms. But using Vedantic terms, you can say uniting the soul with God. Yoga, in a Vedantic sense, is any spiritual practice that unites or reunites the soul with the divine. Interestingly, completely as an aside, the word religion, religio in Latin, re means again, ligio, ligament, connecting or binding. So rebinding the soul with God. So in its etymological sense, the word religion means essentially the same thing as yoga in the Vedantic sense. But it's a digression because we're not talking about Vedanta. We're talking about Patanjali's yoga. So then, what exactly does yoga mean in Patanjali's system if it does not mean, on the one hand, postural yoga, which is common in the West, and it also does not mean yoking or uniting, which is the standard Vedantic understanding of yoga, karma yoga, jnana yoga, bhakti yoga, raja yoga. Vyasa. Remember Vyasa? He's the first and most important commentator on the Yoga Sutras. Some scholars, like Philip Moss, claim that Vyasa was actually Patanjali. As I said, I don't want to enter into that scholarly hornet's nest. So let's just keep calling him Vyasa. Vyasa says in his commentary on 1.1, Yogaha Samadhihi. Yogaha Samadhihi. Yoga means samadhi, according to Patanjali. Okay? What is samadhi? Well, we'll talk about it in detail later, but what we need to know now is that it is the highest goal of yoga. It's the spiritual state in which one realizes one's essence as Purusha, completely separate from Prakriti. There are different kinds of samadhi, and we'll talk about that a bit later. Sampragyata samadhi is a penultimate kind of samadhi in which there is meditative one-pointed concentration on an object. What is the object? It depends. One of them is God, and there are other possible objects. But that's not the highest stage of samadhi. The final and highest stage of samadhi is asampragyata samadhi. And that is pure objectless consciousness. It's just pure awareness. You're just the Purusha. And it's not even right to say that you're a witness of anything. You're not witnessing anything. It's just Purusha. So yoga in Patanjali's system is defined in terms of its spiritual goal. That's extremely important to understand. Okay? So when we hear yoga and we're thinking Patanjali, we should immediately be reminded of what is the ultimate goal we're trying to reach through all these practices, Ashtanga yoga. It's samadhi. Okay? I think it's worth looking at page 5 of Bryant's commentary. We're not going to go through every word of Bryant's commentary. That would take us way too long, but I'm just pulling out some of the most important things. So let's look at page 5, last full paragraph, starting with the word Vyasa. Edwin Bryant says, Vyasa, the primary and most important commentator, whose commentary is almost as canonical as Patanjali's primary text, then proceeds to discuss yoga, the second word in the sutra. In accordance with the famous Sanskrit grammarian Panini, He glosses yoga with samadhi, the ultimate subject matter of the Yoga Sutras. So he's adding something which is an important detail. Panini, the great Sanskrit grammarian, he defines the verbal root yuj as samadhi. That's one of the possibilities. It can also mean yoking, but one of the distinct possibilities is samadhi. So it's not like Patanjali or Vyasa is inventing some kind of weird etymology. It's perfectly legitimate to interpret yoga as samadhi. That's something to keep in mind. Let's go on. Bryant says, samadhi consists of various contemplative stages of mental concentration that will be described in detail throughout the text. Indeed, the commentator Vachaspati Mishra traces the etymology of yoga to one of the meanings of the root yuj, to contemplate, which he points out is the correct etymology here. The more established etymology from the perspective of modern historical linguistics is, of course, derived from the same Indo-European root as the English word yoke. That's also interesting. There's some overlap between English words and Sanskrit words, because linguists posit that there was this Proto-Indo-European language, which is the root language of, the mother of, Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek, from which more or less all modern languages derive. So that when you find similarities between English words and Sanskrit words, that's because of the same common parent. It's quite interesting. So yoke is a really interesting example. Yoga, yoke, meaning something similar, right? Connecting. Then Bryant says, yoga can thus mean that which joins, that is, unites one with the absolute truth. And while this translation of the term is popularly found, and may be apt in other contexts, such as the Gita 9.34, so Gita is a Vedantic scripture, so not surprisingly it's going to understand yoga in the sense of connecting the soul with the divine, unlike yoga, right? It is best avoided in the context of the Yoga Sutras, since, as was pointed out over 100 years ago by the famous Indologist Max Mueller, and long before that by the 16th century Indian doxographer Madhava, the goal of yoga, meaning Patanjali's yoga here, is not to join, but the opposite. This is very interesting. The goal of yoga, Patanjali's yoga, is not to join, but the opposite, to unjoin. That is, to disconnect Purusha from Prakriti. If the term is to mean yoke, it entails yoking the mind on an object of concentration without deviation. But the last sentence is a little confusing because it doesn't mean yoke in Patanjali. So it does not mean yoke. It means, if anything, the opposite of yoking. Right now, our mistake, we suffer because we think that we're yoked to Prakriti, that we think we're united to Prakriti. And the whole point of yoga is to realize that we were never actually connected with Prakriti. That the Purusha, the soul, is eternally separate from nature, Prakriti, and its workings. Okay? So I think it's a nice way of putting it. Next important thing, in Vyasa's commentary on 1.1, Atha Yoganushāsanam, Vyasa talks about 5 habitual states of mind. So please look at the board. 5 habitual states of mind. Our mind can at any given moment be usually in one of these 5 states. And I've given the Sanskrit terms, which he doesn't give. I kind of wish that he did, to be honest. I'm now talking about Bryant's page 6, okay? Bottom of page 5 and then top of page 6. Vyasa notes that when the mind is directed toward an object, it can manifest 5 different degrees of focus, bhumis. And here are his translations, and I think the reason why I gave the Sanskrit is because different commentators and translators translate these 5 terms in very different ways. So I'm going to give you Bryant's first, then we'll look at Hariharananda Āraṇya's, and we'll look at Swamiji's, Swami Vivekananda's, and they're all different, interestingly. Bryant, first state of mind is kshipta. He translates as wondering. The first time I saw wondering, I thought it might be a typo for wandering, but it's not. He means wondering. W-O-N. Okay. Second, mudha. Oops, there should be a long. There we go. Okay. Mudha. Mudha here, Bryant translates as confused. Okay, it can mean deluded also. Third, vikshipta. You add the prefix v to the kshipta and you get the third state of mind. Vikshipta. But what does it mean? Different people have different interpretations. But Bryant says distracted. Okay? Bryant so far, okay, well, let me finish what Bryant says. Fourth, ekagra, he says concentrated. Fifth, niruddha, Bryant says restrained. So Bryant's renderings are wondering, confused, distracted, concentrated, and restrained.
So niruddha is not the same as nirodha.
It is, except that it's the adjectival form. Restrained, and nirodha is restraint, noun form. But it's the same verbal root. Yeah, good catch, exactly. And then Bryant goes on to immediately say, it is the last two that are of interest to yoga. They're the states of mind that we want to cultivate. When the mind, chitta, is restrained and concentrated, so these last two, ekagra and niruddha, or fixed on one point, a type of samadhi known as sampragyata can be attained. And okay, we'll finish the paragraph a bit later. But I wanted to first talk a little bit more about these terms, because wondering, I wonder about the translation wonder. I think that I wonder that there might be better translations. So let's look at Hariharananda. Let me read from his. He says the first is restless. I sort of am inclined to think that that's a little better, to be honest. And then you might ask, well, what's the difference between that and vikshipta then? He renders vikshipta as distracted, and the middle term as stupefied or infatuated. Okay, so the second term is more or less everybody's in the same ballpark, deluded, confused. But 1 and 3 is where the commentators really kind of differ in interesting ways. But let me read to you. Hariharananda sometimes has these wonderfully insightful comments. And so here's what he says. He explains each of the 5 states. And I like this better than Bryant's in a way. It's very sadhana-oriented. He was a great yogi himself, Hariharananda Āraṇya. So he says, first explaining kshipta, okay? Hariharananda says restless. The mind which is naturally restless, kshipta, has not the patience or intelligence necessary for contemplation of a supersensuous subject, and consequently cannot think of or comprehend any subtle principle. Okay. Then he says, what is the mudha mind? The stupefied or infatuated mind? The mind which through obsession or infatuation in a matter connected with the senses is unfit to think of subtle principles is called a stupefied mind, mudha. People engrossed in thoughts of family or wealth generally concentrate on them. This is an example of concentration of an infatuated mind. Then he says, what about vikshipta? The third is the distracted vikshipta mind. This is different from the restless mind. So he already anticipates the objection, well, what's the difference between 1 and 3? This is different from the restless mind. Now, this is really interesting. And it's similar to what Swami Vivekananda says about the third term. We'll get to that in a second. Hariharananda says, most spiritual devotees have this type of mind, spiritual aspirants. It's very interesting. They have this vikshipta mind. A mind which can be calm sometimes and disturbed at other times is regarded as a distracted mind in the sense of vikshipta. Our mind isn't always on spiritual matters. Sometimes it is, which is good. Sometimes it's not, right? And that's the whole point of we're struggling. We're spiritual aspirants. Then he says, when temporarily calm, a distracted mind can understand the real nature of subtle principles when it hears of them and can contemplate on them for a time. On account of difference in intelligence and other traits of character, there are innumerable varieties amongst men with distracted mind. There can be concentration even with a distracted mind, but such concentration does not last long, as any of us who have been initiated or have attempted meditation knows. We might be able to concentrate for a few seconds or minutes, but then eventually the mind will go back to worldly objects. Then Hariharananda says, because the basic trait of such a mind, again, this is vikshipta, is calmness at one time and restlessness at another. And Swamiji here, I think also helpfully, he renders these 5 terms as the following. Kshipta, Swami Vivekananda says, scattering. Mudha, darkening. Vikshipta, gathering. Gathering is very interesting. 4, ekagra is one-pointed, and 5th, niruddha is concentrated. But again, this gathering is quite interesting. And Swamiji also says, I'm just going to focus on his how he explains gathering. He says, the commentator says, and here I'm not sure what commentator he has in mind. I don't think it's Vyasa, because Vyasa doesn't talk about this, but he says the following. Swamiji says, the commentator says, the third form, vikshipta, gathering, is natural to the devas, the angels. And the first and second, kshipta and mudha, to the demons. The gathering form is when it struggles to center itself. So you see the connection with Hariharananda Āraṇya? Struggle. The struggle is what spiritual practice, being a spiritual aspirant, is all about. Okay, so I looked it up. I don't think Vyasa says this. So when he says the commentator, typically I think Swamiji means Vyasa, but here I think it must be some other commentator. If any of you are aware of who that might be, please note it in the YouTube comments or tell me. Okay. Now, what are the fourth and fifth according to Hariharananda Āraṇya? The fourth is the one-pointed ekagra mind. Remember, it's only these two which are most essential for attaining the goal of yoga. The mind which is pointed to one direction only, that is, holds on to one thing only, is called a one-pointed mind. Patanjali has defined it later as a mind wherein, on the fading away of one thought, the same thought arises again in succession. So Indian thinkers are fond of using the analogy of pouring oil in an unbroken flow from one container to another. Without break, that's the idea. So just like that, you should be thinking about spiritual things continuously without any break, without any interruption. Yeah.
So if you, most spiritual seekers...
Do we want a mic so that people online can hear?
So if most spiritual thinkers are in vikshipta, is that it?
Spiritual aspirants, yeah.
Spiritual aspirants.
Seekers, fine, yeah.
So if your mind is scattered or calm, that's in this one. When it's calm, could it be in ekagra and nirodha?
I mean, no, these are very high states. So, but it's a kind of, you get a glimpse maybe of the ekagrata state, a very brief kind of one-pointedness maybe. That's a good question. But I don't think that it's the full-blown ekagrata. I think that's a more advanced stage. Thank you. Now, fifth state, Hariharananda says, niruddha. What is the niruddha state of the mind? The fifth state is that in which the thought processes have been stopped or arrested at will by long disciplinary practice. Nirodha. That's the connection with the noun and adjective form. This is the last state of the mind. When through practice all thoughts can be shut out from the mind for a long time, the mind can be regarded as having reached an arrested state. When by this process the mind stuff gradually ceases to function, then only liberation is achieved. I'm sorry, I skipped 4. Did I skip 4? Yeah, let me read 4. 1 second. And 4, Hariharananda says, the ekagra mind, he says, oh no, I did talk about 4, but I didn't finish it. Yeah, but let me finish it. So he's explaining how when the same thought occurs again and again, then he says, when it becomes a habit of the mind, that is, when the mind is occupied wholly with the same thought which continues even in dream, then the state of the mind can be really called one-pointed. So you see how that doesn't, it's such a high state that you don't really get that in the vikshipta state of a spiritual aspirant, because you're not experiencing it 24 hours a day in that way. When one-pointedness is mastered, it leads to sampragyanta samadhi. Sampragyanta, that's the penultimate kind of samadhi. That samadhi or concentration is real yogic samadhi leading to salvation, the highest which is asampragyanta samadhi. Okay. Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind. But in general, it goes from sort of very worldly, 1 and 2, demonic kind of qualities which keep us bound to this world of samsara, having to come back again and again, suffering again and again, to the middle category, which is us, most of us spiritual aspirants. We're trying. Sometimes we have these moments of light and concentration, but often we get restless and distracted. And 4 and 5 is when we're really moving into the highest attainments of yoga, okay? Remember, 1.1 is Atha Yoga Anushasanam. Atha means now. Now begins Yoga Anushasanam. The Anushasanam of yoga. Shasanam itself means teaching. So there's an interesting question of why do they prefix the word shasanam with anu? Okay? Anu means again or further. So this is Patanjali's, some commentators say, this is Patanjali's humble way of saying, hey, I didn't invent this yoga philosophy. I belong to an ancient lineage. And I am simply conveying to you what my masters have taught me. I'm not the originator of yoga philosophy. You'll find that this is very characteristic of the Indian mind and Indian spiritual personages in general, is that it's almost the opposite of the Western mindset, which is take credit and like, I'm highly original, I did this, I did that. And in India, it's, I didn't do this. Saying I did this means that it like you lose credibility. So you want to say, no, I belong to an ancient lineage. I'm just reporting what other people have already taught me.
That was saying, for Indian state of mind, don't just do something, sit there.
Oh, okay, that's good. Yeah, I haven't heard that. Don't just do something, sit there. Thank you. Okay. One other thing I wanted to flag regarding Bryant's commentary on 1.1. It's complicated, and I don't want this to turn into a big thing, please. But page 8, he brings up the subtle body. And I do think, okay, let's read the paragraph, okay? Page 8, for the only full paragraph on the page. Bryant says, it is essential to fully grasp this fundamental point in order to understand the yoga system. What is the fundamental point? He's about to say. Just as in most religious systems, the body is commonly accepted to be extraneous to and separable from some notion of a soul or life force and discarded at death. He's thinking of Christianity and many other religious traditions, right? But also Indian traditions. So, in contrast to certain major strains of Western thought, according to the yoga system and Hindu thought in general, the mind is also held to be extraneous to and separable from the soul. This is really important. It's not just the physical body which is separate from the soul. The mind is equally insentient and physical. It's just a subtle form of matter. And so it also is separate from the soul. And then Bryant adds an interesting point here, kind of just in passing. He says, although it is discarded not at death, but only upon attaining liberation. In our last birth, when we finally attain liberation, what happens? Even that mind, the subtle, which is going to go on to call the subtle body, more or less, that dissolves as well. And what's left is just the soul. The soul, Bryant says, is enveloped in two external and separable bodies in yoga metaphysics. This is already a little bit problematic in light of our discussion last time, which is Purusha is completely separate from Prakriti. So this language of being enveloped by something sounds a little bit too much like you're already implying some kind of connection between Purusha and Prakriti. But anyway, we have to be careful about not taking that too literally, okay? Because soul here means Purusha. So the Purusha is enveloped in two external and separable bodies in yoga metaphysics. The gross material body consisting of the senses, that's the Sthula Sharira, the gross physical body, the grossly physical body. And the subtle body, Sukshma Sharira, the subtly physical body. Both are physical, but one is grossly physical, the other is subtly physical. And the subtle body consisting of the mind, intellect, ego, and other subtle aspects of the persona. Specifically the Jnana Indriyas and the Karma Indriyas. The senses of knowledge and the senses of action, okay? Okay, then he says, at death, the soul discards the gross body, which returns to the material elements, to dust, but remains encapsulated in the subtle body. This is Bryant's understanding of the yoga view, which is retained from life to life and eventually attains a new gross body in accordance with natural laws like karma, etc. In order to be liberated from the cycle of repeated birth and death, the soul has to be uncoupled from not just the gross body, but the subtle body of the chitta as well. Okay, what's the scholarly controversy here? Well, it's not clear that Patanjali's yoga system actually accepts the subtle body at all. This is a very subtle point. That's why I don't want to get too deep into it, and it's complicated. But the situation is, there's absolutely no definition of the subtle body or discussion of the subtle body in any of the sutras in the Yoga Sutras. That's number one. Number two, strikingly, the Sankhya Karika, one of the most important Sankhya texts, explicitly does talk about the subtle body, the linga sharira. Okay, and in fact, there's a karika in the Sankhya karika. Now we're talking about Sankhya, much earlier than the Yoga Sutras. Specifically says, they ask the question, who is it that reincarnates? Who is it that assumes these different grossly physical bodies? Answer, linga sharira. Just straight gives the answer. And so it's a little surprising that Patanjali is silent on this issue of whether there's a subtle body. Some scholars say, and some of the really foremost scholars of, at least in the West, of yoga philosophy, Ian Witcher, Gerald James Larson, and others. And let me read to you from an article on yoga by Gerald James Larson. He was a professor at UCSB for a long time and one of the major scholars of yoga. He says the following. He's explaining now the process of rebirth. He says, the chitta, which I'll get to this in a second, but just as a brief summary, it means mind, okay? And it includes buddhi, ahankara, and manas in Patanjali's system. So the mind, the chitta, then immediately manifests itself in a new embodiment after leaving one physical body, whose form of life, length of life, and quality of experience have been programmed by and are compatible with the previous rebirth, so based on our karma. Then he says, it should perhaps be noted at this point that yoga differs somewhat from Sankhya with respect to the process of rebirth. Listen carefully. Sankhya interprets the tattvas of buddhi, ahankara, and manas together with the sense capacities and action capacities, karma indriyas and jnana indriyas, in terms of location within a single embodiment, thus requiring a subtle body for transmigration from life to life. What is he saying there? He's saying that Sankhya philosophy interprets these three together, buddhi, ahankara, and manas, along with the jnana indriyas and karma indriyas, as a spatio-temporally located subtle body. It's not like you can't see it with your eyes, but because it's subtly physical, but it has spatio-temporal location. And your subtle body is located in a different place in space-time than yours and mine and whatever. And so it literally migrates. The subtle body in Sankhya literally, and even in Vedanta, it literally migrates. That's why in near-death experiences, they have this outer body experience, many people report having that, and they can literally report. They say, yeah, I was at the corner of the hospital room, and I could tell you what you were doing. There's one case where, recently, I think, they said that I saw you, the surgeon, when they came out of the coma, they said, I saw you flapping your wings like a bird. And he said, that's incredible, because the surgeons don't normally do that. That was just his thing that he would do. But that patient who was from the corner of the room saw him from that angle, flapping his wings. Okay, that's another random point. Yeah, Mike.
So I'm confused when they say that there's no subtle body when he says the mind is the subtle body.
No. So that's why I don't want to get too bogged down on this. But my whole point is
that the part
Bryant.
Too subtle?
Well, no, Bryant thinks there is a subtle body in yoga, and what I'm saying is it's more complicated than that. That's the main point I'm trying to say. Different scholars of yoga have different views on this issue. Some think that Patanjali does presuppose a subtle body, which is Bryant's view. Others, like Gerald James Larson and Ian Witcher, claim that there's no subtle body. And then you might ask, well, then how in the world is there rebirth and what exactly is reborn? So let me just continue, and then there will. So he says, yoga, in contrast to Sankhya, construes the composite notion of mind, or chitta, okay, all three of those, as all-pervasive, vibhu, not spatio-temporally located, thus eliminating the need for a transmigrating subtle body. Because the mind, or chitta, is all-pervasive, rebirth occurs immediately upon the cessation of a particular embodiment. And he gives the reference here, which we'll get to in the future, Yoga Sutra 2.13. So this is quite interesting. Pages 198 to 199 of Larson's article, Materialism, Dualism, and the Philosophy of Yoga, published in the International Journal of Hindu Studies. Okay, so as I said, it gets very technical and complicated. But what is he saying? He's saying that there's this chitta, which is all-pervasive, and the moment you leave one grossly physical body at the time of death, that chitta, because it's all-pervasive, it will find the next body that's going to inhabit. There's no intermediate state. There are no heavens and hells in yoga's philosophy. According to Larson, as I said, not everybody agrees. Whereas if you posit a subtle body, then you can posit intermediate states between births. There can be little temporary heavens, hells, eternal heavens, all sorts of wonderful things. And you can go to these different lokas. But according to according to Larson, No. As the moment you drop this physical body, you get reborn into another one until you attain liberation. Okay? Anyway, it does get very complicated, and it's really murky. The whole issue is very murky. That's why I don't want to open I just opened the can of worms. I'm going to shut it again right now. Get back in there. Okay. So, now. All right. 1.2. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Nirodha. Good. Okay. Yeah. It's okay. It's fine. Okay, let's have you repeat it. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Thank you. Okay. Now, first key thing to keep in mind. The term Chitta is used throughout the Yoga Sutra. What does Chitta mean? Fortunately, there's a very simple answer to this. It's this equation. Chitta, according to Patanjali, is buddhi, plus ahankara, plus manas. Okay? Buddhi plus ahankara plus manas. What is buddhi? Most of us know this, but intellect, right? And so what does the intellect do? It does things like judge, discriminate. Knowledge has different knowledge of different things. It also wills. All these things. This is all discussed by Bryant at length. I'm just summarizing. Ahankara. What is ahankara? The I sense. Very good. Exactly. It's what makes you say, I, me, mine, own things, that's mine, that's not mine, and feel like an I, right? Like think in the first person.
Ego?
Yeah, that's another way of putting it. Yeah. I-ness, I sense, ego. Yeah. I think it's better to stick with the ones that we're talking about, yeah. Because then it depends on what are you identifying with, and it gets complicated. So I sense, that's the simplest thing. And manas. This is that aspect of the mind which is involved in organizing sensory input. When you take things in from the external world and process that, that's the manas that does that. What's confusing about this? Well, because in English, often the term manas is rendered as mind, and so is the term chitta. That can lead to a lot of confusion. And so that's why Bryant, I think wisely, chooses not to use the English translation of manas. He just says manas. Because it has a very specialized function. And it's just one aspect of chitta. And he says chitta, he translates as mind, which I think is quite sensible and common sense, right? Because when we say mind, we really have the whole kit and caboodle in mind here. The I sense, the mind, the aspect of the mind that processes sensory inputs, and also all these great things that buddhi does, discriminating and knowing and all these, and willing, right? That's there too. Where is it? That's interesting. I think that I'll have to get back to you on that. But maybe manas. But I don't want to commit to that. I'll try to look that up. Okay. So we've got the definition of one of these terms, chitta. Mind. It just means mind in a very simple sense. Now, what does vritti mean? Vritti is any permutation or activity of the mind. This is Bryant's definition on page 13 of his commentary, and I think that's perfectly fine. Vritti literally means kind of whirlpool or fluctuation. So any change of the mind, change of state of the mind. Okay. Swami Vivekananda here gives, I think, a very helpful metaphor in his commentary. The metaphor of a lake. Swami Vivekananda says, the bottom of a lake we cannot see because its surface is covered with ripples. So the ripples here are the vrittis. Okay. It is only possible for us to catch a glimpse of the bottom when the ripples have subsided and the water is calm. If the water is muddy or is agitated all the time, the bottom will not be seen. If it is clear and there are no waves, we shall see the bottom. The bottom of the lake is our own true self, capital S, Purusha. The lake is the chitta. And the waves, the vrittis. The ripples or waves are the vrittis. So the second sutra is saying, what is yoga? Chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is already defined as samadhi. What exactly is samadhi? Chitta vritti nirodha. total cessation of all fluctuations or changes of the mind. Why do we want that? Because, like in Swamiji's analogy, you can only perceive the soul, the Purusha in its essence, when you remove those distracting kind of ripples or waves that are blocking that vision of the bottom of the lake, right? Which is the self or the Purusha. That's the idea. So when the surface of the lake becomes completely calm or still, you let the Purusha shine forth in its essence as pure consciousness, pure awareness. Okay. Now, another can of worms which I already opened in the last class, in which I'm maybe unwisely reopening again today, is this question of who exactly is bound and liberated according to yoga philosophy. It's a huge question in both Sankhya and Yoga. And we talked about why it's a problem. Why can't it be Purusha? Well, because Purusha is eternally liberated. So it's not the kind of thing that can be bound or bound, right? Or suffer. And it has nothing to do with Prakriti. What about Prakriti? Why can't Prakriti or some aspect of Prakriti be what's bound and liberated? Because Prakriti is insentient. So how can something insentient feel like it's suffering or bound, or that it feels liberated? Also seems like not the right candidate to be bound or liberated. So that was the thing that we discussed, the big question we discussed at length in our last class. Now, I find, this is my own impression, since hopefully many of you have done your homework. I don't know what you guys think about this, but I come away from Bryant's commentary on 1.1 and 2 feeling like he sort of toggles back and forth between talking about the Purusha as bound and liberated, and sometimes as suggesting that it's some aspect of Prakriti, like specifically Buddhi, which is bound and liberated. And he uses different metaphors and different... And I just want to give you a couple examples, like... page 15. We can go to page 15. He quotes the Sankhya Sūtras. So this is an ancient text, or at least very old. And I'm not going to read the whole block paragraph, but the key point is toward the end of the block paragraph where it says, giving up the idea of being made of Prakriti, the soul thinks, because I am the son of Brahman, I am Brahman, not a product of samsara. Clearly this text is suggesting that it's the Purusha, which felt bound and which then finally attains liberation, right? And then Bryant glosses this as follows. He says, thus the soul appears to undergo the experiences of the body and mind, birth, death, disease, old age, happiness, distress, peacefulness, anxiety, etc. But these are mere transformations of the body and mind. In other words, they are the permutations of gross and subtle matter external to the soul that are pervaded by the soul's awareness. The mind, now here, notice the language, is very cagey. The mind misidentifies the pure self with these permutations and considers the pure self to be subject to birth and death, happiness and distress, etc. Let's look at that sentence again. The mind misidentifies the pure self with these permutations of gross and subtle matter and considers the pure self to be subject to birth and death, happiness and distress, etc. So here there's a slight difference. So, Sankhya Sutra seems to be saying it's Purusha, which thinks that it's bound and now it's liberated. Now he's saying it's the mind, Chitta, or Buddhi most likely is thinking of, which misidentifies. That's the one making the mistake. The thing, the entity making the mistake is not actually Purusha, but an aspect of Chitta, the Buddhi, which misidentifies the Purusha with the workings of Prakriti. So I feel this toggling going on back and forth in Bryant's commentary. To his credit, something I didn't mention in the last class, but which I'll mention now. He's got a section called Concluding Reflections at the very end of this fat book. And it's on pages specifically 462 to 4... Well, it starts on page 461, okay? Concluding Reflections. And there's a whole section devoted to this issue. It's quite interesting. And that section is called Purusha and Free Will, pages 462 to 466. And Bryant, I strongly recommend that you read it just on your own. Optional, of course, but still, it's very interesting for those who are interested. On my understanding of Bryant here, he thinks this is a really, really serious problem. This problem that we've been discussing in this class and in the previous class. And as a result, he says the following. He says, therefore, neither quite works exactly. Like it's neither quite the Prakriti. It can't be because it's insentient. And it can't be the pure Sankhyan Purusha either. Because that's completely separate from Prakriti. And is ever liberated, eternally liberated, and is not the doer. So you know what he says? He says, but notice that Patanjali never denies doership to Purusha. Patanjali never explicitly says that the Purusha is the non-doer, the akarta. Sankhya definitely does. So what Bryant says is, it's possible that what Patanjali implied is that Purusha actually is a doer and is capable of willing and is an agent. In which case, now Bryant is saying, it would be the Purusha, but a kind of non-Sankhyan Purusha, do you see? Which is bound and liberated. So this is a very radical and interesting idea. I mean, whether you find it plausible or not is another question. I think that's a pretty radical departure from Sankhya. It's pretty extreme. And it requires, I think, a lot of evidence to substantiate. He's building a case based on the fact that Patanjali does not explicitly deny doership to the Purusha. And so he says, yeah, so I think it's most plausible to take Purusha to be a doer, and then it's the Purusha that's bound and liberated. But it's not as simple as that, I think. But it's a really interesting idea. So I think it's worth just keeping in mind for yourself. Okay. Finally, one of the final points I want to make is a large part of the commentary is devoted to the three gunas. Did we already talk about the three gunas in this class? Maybe not. But many of you are probably familiar with the three gunas from Vedanta. Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. Okay. And so another way that traditional commentators and Edwin Bryant and Swami Vivekananda, he talks about the three gunas in his commentary as well. Another way to explain 1.2, Chitta Vritti Nirodha, the restraint of mental modifications, of mental fluctuations, is in terms of the three gunas. The idea is, so long as a mind is dominated by tamas and rajas. Tamas is the guna of inertia, stupor, delusion, confusion, and so on. Rajas, the guna of the energy of activity, restlessness, ambition, power, ego, arrogance, and so on and so forth. And sattva is the good spiritual guna. This is the guna which manifests as calmness and humility and selflessness and all these and nice spiritual qualities. Okay. When the mind is dominated by rajas and tamas, what happens? Mind is full of chitta vrittis. The mind is constantly fluctuating. If you're full of rajas, thoughts of all sorts of wonderful worldly pleasures and attachments and things you want to do and this and that. If it's full of tamas, then there are often thoughts of injuring others, a certain kind of... You'll find that people who are always complaining about other people and resentful, full of tamas. Okay, so now, another way of redescribing the whole project of yoga and yogic spiritual practice is trying to make the mind as sattvic as possible. That's just a different way of putting the same thing. Try to make the mind as sattvic as possible. The Gita talks about it at length, especially in chapter 18, 17 and 18. Why? Because the more sattvic the mind is, the fewer the vrittis, the fewer the fluctuations in the mind. And the closer we get to the goal of samadhi and chitta vritti nirodha. Okay? Another subtle point that Bryant makes here, which is important to just keep in mind, as spiritual aspirants, I don't think it's crucial. I'll explain why in a second. But he says the following. Interestingly, the recognition in the state of sampragyata samadhi that the Purusha is completely separate from Prakriti. So it's a kind of viveka, like a kind of discrimination, spiritual discrimination between Purusha and Prakriti. That's not the highest goal. Why? Because viveka itself, that discrimination, that act of discriminating between Purusha and Prakriti, is itself a kind of chittavritti. It's a very spiritual chittavritti, but it's nonetheless a vritti, which itself ultimately has to be restrained, got rid of, in order to reach the highest asampragyata samadhi state. Why do I say that that's not crucial for spiritual practice? Because we're not there yet. First make the mind as sattvic as possible, then... And the beauty of it is once you become very sattvic, you don't need to worry about how do I transcend sattva or how do I get rid of that last viveka vritti. The mind itself becomes a guru. That's why in Sri Ramakrishna's story of the three gunas, the three robbers, the third robber, sattva, takes the poor man, unties him, says, hey, you need to go in this direction. And that poor man says, why don't you come with me? You've been so kind, come with me. He says, where are you going? I can't follow. But he points him in that direction. So in the same way, become sattvic. Once the mind becomes very sattvic, the mind itself will become the guru. And you don't need to worry. So, and what happens in spiritual life, these days especially, spirituality has become very, commercialized in a way. You can get it on the cheap by just taking ayahuasca or something. So people think that spiritual life is very easy and that, becoming sattvic, that's a very low ideal, The whole point is to transcend the three gunas, not to become sattvic. That's I was sattvic 100 lives ago. Now I need to transcend. No, we're all full of rajas and tamas, and so the priority is make ourselves as sattvic as possible. Even if the ultimate goal is to transcend the three gunas and all vrittis, don't worry about it. That's not a practicable or actionable goal. So focus on the present now, and don't delude yourself. We should try to avoid self-deception in spiritual life. That's really important. Okay, and let me ask you this. We've now read and discussed the first two sutras of the Yoga Sutra, 1.1 and 1.2. Atha Yoga Anushasanam, 1.1. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, 1.2. What's the connection between 1.1 and 1.2? How do they relate to each other? How does 1.2 follow logically from 1.1? Any thoughts? Yeah, very good. Yeah, the word yoga, right? That's a very simple way of putting it. 1.1 says, now begins the teachings on yoga. What is yoga? Yoga is chitta vritti nirodha. Very good. Exactly. Yes. Now, if you want to go a little bit more into the meanings of the words and all that, 1.1, remember, Vyasa defines yoga as samadhi. And so 1.2 can be considered to be what you have to do in order to attain samadhi. Or they're almost kind of definitely the same. What is samadhi? Chitta vritti nirodha. The highest kind of samadhi, asampragyanta samadhi. The total restraint of all mental fluctuations is the state of samadhi, which is the definition of yoga on 1.1. Okay? Okay. Let me open it for questions because now... Okay, so that's a lot of material. It's kind of heady. Any questions from the in-person audience? And we'll take from the in-person first because they took the trouble to come here. And then we'll look at online questions. Yes, anyone? Mm-hmm.
It seems that your comment on Bryant's talking about the very unsankhyan description for
of the Purusha.
Of the Purusha.
As a doer, yeah.
It seemed to be very Aurobindo describing a very more Vedantic description of a Sankhyan Purusha from the Gita. So.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I mean, Bryant actually talks about how, he says, pretty much every school of Indian philosophy other than Sankhya posits the Purusha as a doer, as an agent. Purusha in the sense of jiva. So the Vedanta uses the term jiva. And it's the jiva who feels bound and liberated. Ramanuja believes it, so does Shankara, so does... Of course, Shankara says ultimately that jiva is not real, but setting that aside, all Vedantins posit a jiva. And so they don't have that same difficulty that Sankhya and Yoga do in explaining who is bound and liberated, because they just say it's a jiva. The individual soul, which feels bound, is liberated, it's an agent. So I think that's right, yeah. Oh yeah, let's not bring in too many other terms. Purushottama is a term from the Gita. And no, it has nothing to do with that really. So we should stick to the terms used in the Yoga Sutra itself. I still think that interpreting the Purusha in this way as a kind of doer and a willer, it's deviating too starkly from Sankhya, I think, to be plausible. That's my own take, but you guys can think for yourselves about that. Okay, online questions? Keshav, if you want. And anyone in person too, if you think of anything, you can ask. But let's hear one online question.
Is the Kriya Yoga of Paramahansa Yogananda part of Raja Yoga?
It's interesting. Yeah, see, I mean, Kriya Yoga, first of all, see, these are terms, right, in Sanskrit. And they mean different things in different contexts. The term Kriya Yoga is used in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra as well. We'll get to that in chapter 2 of the Yoga Sutra. What does it mean? It has a very specific definition. Tapas Swadhyaya Ishvara Pranidhanani, Kriya Yoga. These three things. Now, Paramahansa Yogananda has given the name Kriya Yoga to his own tradition and spiritual practice. Does it mean exactly what Patanjali means by it? I don't think so. I think that it involves many other aspects too. Some people here might be better experts in his tradition and philosophy than I am, but I don't think it's exactly the same. And so when you ask about that, it gets confusing because the same terms are used but in different ways. But that's a short answer. Any other online questions? Or in person?
Prakriti, Maya, and Shakti are all synonyms. They're one and the same. They are also of Brahman, but they are not Brahman itself. Is that correct?
I mean, maybe from a Vedantic standpoint, but probably not from a yogic standpoint. The term Brahman is not used anywhere in the Yoga Sutra. The term Maya is not used anywhere in the Yoga Sutra. The term Shakti, there's a specific use of the word Shakti as Chitti Shakti, but that has a different meaning altogether from what's meant by the questioner. We have to be very careful to grant space to and uniqueness to each of the different traditions within the Indian landscape. And we have to be very careful not to just project or read Vedantic ideas into Sankhya texts, yoga texts. It's a common mistake that people make, but I think we have to be on our guard about that. Because we love Vedanta and we've studied a lot of Vedanta, so that when we always got those Vedanta glasses on. Whenever we read other texts, even when we read the Bible, we're going to be reading Vedanta into the Bible. And it's not that it's wrong, but you see, as spiritual aspirants, okay, do what works for you, and that's fine. But if you're actually trying to get at what Patanjali meant, if you're trying to take his own philosophy and spiritual practices on their own terms, then try to remove the glasses. For the purposes of serious and reverential study of a text, I think that's what I would suggest. Other questions? Any more online questions? Okay, there's this no end of online questions. Okay, one more, so go ahead. Viveka.
Okay, so this one, it says it's a question that's aside from the question.
Uh-oh.
How should a Vijnani look into the concept that one eternal soul can have two eternal spiritual bodies at different spiritual abodes, as found in Gaudiya Vaishnavism?
Okay. Yeah, no, this is so far off topic that it's better not to address. Although it's a very interesting question, as far as I can tell, nothing to do with Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. So we'll table that. Any questions from the in-person audience here? Yes, Ellis.
I think I know the answer, but just to clarify, we're reading Sankhya into the Yoga Sutras because of Vyasa's commentary, correct?
No, for a deeper reason, which is that Patanjali's yoga philosophy is known to be based on the metaphysics of Sankhya.
Okay.
They're considered to be sister philosophical traditions.
Okay. Not just because of the okay.
Huh? Yeah. It's not just because of Vyasa. No. I mean, yeah, they go hand in hand. It doesn't mean that they're identical, but they're like paired. And Patanjali's yoga philosophy is said to be based on Sankhya. Yeah.
When anyone, including Patanjali or even Swami Vivekananda, differs from the philosophy of Sri Ramakrishna, should we choose to believe Sri Ramakrishna over them?
Okay, this is another one of these Vijnana Vedanta questions. It has nothing to do with Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. And so I think it's better not to answer it now. Even though they're good questions. But, huh? Fasting? Okay, ask that question. That's fine. That's sort of related to the three gunas.
So I've noticed that fasting increases my focus and ability to cease thoughts. The longer I fast and meditate, the more intense focus and stillness. Should I eat less to become sattvic?
Wow. Okay. If it works for you, then do it. I mean, there's no one size fits all here. And some people find fasting beneficial. So do it, but do it, within limits and, eat properly and nutritiously so that you keep the body going and you're healthy. So yeah, do whatever works. There are many things that I have a separate lecture on the three gunas and how to make yourself sattvic, so you can look up that lecture on YouTube if you want. Try to make everything in your life sattvic. And I think people tend to overemphasize food sometimes. In certain spiritual traditions especially, food becomes an obsession, and spiritual life is all about what you eat and what you don't eat. I think that can become, Swami Vivekananda scathingly used to say, religion has moved into the kitchen. And so let's not make that mistake either. That's one among many, many things that need to be modified and tempered in order to become more sattvic. Yeah. Look at the Gita chapters 17 and 18 to look at more concrete examples of how to make your life sattvic. Okay, I think we're good. Thank you very much, guys. See you next month for class 3. Please do the homework. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.